All right, welcome. So we are going to continue working with importing data. We're going to continue working with the same kind of smaller students data frame that we've been working with in previous videos. We've talked about how we can just do a basic import with read underscore CSV, which is a function from the reader package in the tidyverse. We talked about how we can customize uh, the strings that are treated as NAs during the import stage. Next, I want to talk about how we can rename columns during that stage. So up top, if I just run the read CSV file name and tweak the argument, the text that's going to be treated as an NA, this was the resulting data frame that we got, and it had column names that were not ideal. So we talked about ways that we could fix these column names after we did the import. But with read underscore CSV, it is certainly possible to change the names on the import. So that argument in the function is called column names. So with an underscore between column COL and names. So I would just say col names equals and then create a vector of character strings that have, and I need to type these inside of double quotes, that give the new names for each of the columns. So these are the names that I'm going to choose to rename each of those columns, and then we can print it to the screen. And we haven't talked about the skip argument yet, so I'm going to comment that out first, and let's take a look at what happens. So if I just say this is going to kind of define what the missing values are, this defines the column names over here. So now I have the right column names. But if you look at what was imported, it then treated that first row in my CSV file as an observation. So here was the CSV file. By default, when you import using read underscore CSV, it assumes that your first row in the file is all headers, is telling us what to name each of the columns. So that's what happened when we did the import up here. It just assumed that that first row, which had all of this information, was the headers, the column names, and then the second row is the first observation. So there's an argument in these functions, both the read underscore CSV and the read dot CSV. But for this one, it's col underscore names. And the default is that that is set equal to true, and it's going to pull off the column names from the very first row. So if I want to hand enter my own column names, I can enter those column names in the col names argument, but I also then need to tell R to ignore that first row because that's not an observation. It's column names and it's poorly chosen column names. So that's what this skip argument does for us. So here I've added two more arguments to this command. The skip argument says how many rows are you going to skip? The column names is indicating what are going to be the names for your columns. So by combining those two options, I've ignored when I do the input, it's not going to import this first row at all. It's going to skip it. And the first row it's going to import is going to be this one, which is our first observation. So that's what I see over here. And it ignored that first row, and instead it's using the column names that I entered into the function. So I had to do a combination of ignore the column names that were entered into the CSV file and instead use these column names. And remember that if I didn't do the skip argument, it would still read in that first row, which was the bad column names, and it's going to think that that's our first observation, which caused a whole bunch of problems on the import. And you can always skip more than one row. So if I want to skip the first 3 rows, I could do skip equals 3, and then that ignored this 1, this 2, and this 3 row, and then the first row that it imports would have been student ID 3. And we can see that over here, the first row that was imported was student ID 3. But in this case, I want to ignore just the first row that had the bad column names and instead override that and enter my own column names. So that's how you could do the import and name your columns in simultaneously within one command, is using this additional argument. There is nothing wrong with doing the import first and then doing the rename second with a different function. That's totally fine too. So the previous way that we did it was just fine. If we were using the base R function read.csv, we had problems when we imported that as well. So here is what let me find it from earlier. Yeah. So when we imported it, read.csv, it was students version 2. It looked like this. We had different column names. These column names were better. They didn't have spaces in them, but we might want to adjust them to snake case names as well. They weren't following snake case. So if we were doing this with the base R function read.csv, then what I could do is I could, first of all, I could store all of my new column names into an object that I call new names itself. And that might help make the code a little bit more concise inside of the function rather than have to type that vector inside of the function.